My driver, Kostler, practically ruined the whole thing. He always saw red whenever tanks showed up. The firing couldn't start fast enough for him. He would have preferred to ram them. He had already started the engine. He repeatedly demanded that we start firing. He couldn't understand our quiet at all. My gunner, Unteroffizier Carius, had been one of those older university students who enjoyed his drinking. Compared to his former superiors, I got along quite well with him. Unfortunately, we soon had to part company because his request to return to his studies had been approved. I hope that he has his diploma on the wall, despite his liking of the god Bacchus, and that today he holds the position of a chief engineer somewhere. Just as I wanted to call out, "Open fire," Kostler lost his nerves and attempted to move out. The first Russians were no more than 60 meters away from us. Just in the nick of time, Carius cleaned their clock with a round between the turret and the hull. The tank turned off into the ditch and smouldered. There were no more signs of life from the crew. The Russian infantry scattered in the countryside next to the roll barn. Carius was then occupied with the remainder of the enemy tanks. They ran into one another in a wild panic, turned around, and didn't think at all about initiating a fight with us. Only 2 of the 12 T-34S escaped our fire. In the evening, I was called back to the north. We were supposed to conduct a small operation at Shelkunica. Flak personnel took over our security duties at the old position. After 2 days, I had returned. To reinforce me, I received a tank from the 3rd Company. Feldwebel Dittmar was its commander. We weren't counting on any more Russian tanks after the enemy had suffered such a thrashing. As usual, however, we had underestimated Ivan's stubbornness. He arrived at noontime at the exact same spot as he did 2 days before. This time, though, he had closed his hatches in preparation for combat and turned his turrets halfway to the right. By all appearances, however, he had only identified the flak piece and completely overlooked us, the main culprits. The enemy tanks made efforts to detour around their burned-out vehicles. There were 5 of them. They made the big mistake of all driving at the same time and just observing the high ground. When they fired, very inaccurately by the way, they also woke up the flak crew, which had counted completely on us. We knocked out 3 tanks. The rudely awakened flak took care of the rest. Right afterwards, we took a short recon probe to the hill. The Russians had actually brought additional material through the path less marsh. In the evening, we returned to our old position. There we received the mission to occupy the village behind that high ground the next morning. We were thus supposed to open the way for an infantry regiment. 2 more tanks and 3 20mm quad flak guns were attached to me at the onset of darkness. The latter proved themselves magnificently in action against ground targets. It was a moonlit night. I decided to attack as soon as possible. I assumed that the enemy's surprise would compensate somewhat for our numerical inferiority. We formed up, so my Tiger drove point. The tanks and the quads alternated behind it. Using our blackout lights, we approached quite close to the village. Amazingly enough, not a shot was fired. Ivan probably assumed we were one of his own march columns. We stopped just before the village, and the quads opened fire. Against my orders, a gunner also fired on the houses left of the roll barn. The result was that the easterly wind blew the dense smoke over the street and blocked our sight. In the village, we rolled over 3 Russian AT guns located quietly next to houses. We dispersed to provide security and established contact with the regiment. It now approached, combed the houses, and in the morning was able to continue its way north. The raid succeeded without any losses on our own side. Only 2 Russian tanks were able to get away. If we had waited until day to move, the enemy would have brought down a lot of fire on us, as we were able to determine from the material we had captured. Despite all precautions and despite all attempts to seal them off, the Russians had succeeded in continuing to infiltrate our front through the old gap. They had built a long, thin pipeline through which they pumped more and more men and materiel. With our weak forces, we were not in a position to seal off this penetrated area, cut off the Russians, and eradicate the ensuing pocket. The danger became greater every day that the pipeline would burst and that the Russians would encircle us. That was the question that was often asked during the Russian campaign. Who is encircling whom? We were therefore withdrawn to the west in order to prevent any further advances from out of the pipeline. The terrain was simply not suited for tankers. Despite the frost and the snow, there were stretches of marsh everywhere where we could get bogged down. We didn't care for the woods very much either. But compared to conditions in the northern sector of the Eastern Front, we thought we had it quite good there. On November 10th, we made a counterattack at Pugatschina and cut off an outgrowth of the pipeline. Our route went through about 5 kilometers of alpine forest, where the Russians had recently captured 2 German long-barreled 88mm Pak guns. We found these guns, intact and unused. Clearly, Ivan didn't know how to use them. There was nothing left for us to do but blow those undamaged guns to bits. We didn't want to give the Russians yet another opportunity to test their penetrating capabilities on us. We were somewhat careless when we continued to advance after that, and there was soon the crack of cannon fire coming from some direction. One of our vehicles was immediately engulfed in flames. Fortunately, the crew could save themselves by getting into another tank. We moved out rapidly to get back to the main road again. In spite of everything, we had determined that the enemy had only advanced with light forces in this area. All in all, however, the situation remained unclear. Even at higher levels, no one could give us information about the exact position of the battle lines. We had an experience during this time where we didn't know whether to laugh or to cry. A horse-mounted messenger approached us while we were on a security patrol. We drove slowly so as not to make the horse nervous. But when we were even with them, the young horse began to prance. Unfortunately, it jumped so close in front of the left track that my driver couldn't brake fast enough. The animal was so severely hurt that the rider, who was able to jump off, had to give him the coup de grace. We took him aboard and brought him to his unit. There I said for the record that he was not responsible for the incident in any manner. When we drove back, the dead horse had disappeared. I found it again at our field mess. My people had hauled it on a tank. Our rather meagre rations were enriched by it, especially since the meat could be stored for days due to the cold. The next evening we had meatballs. Unaware of the incident, our commander ate 3 pieces and praised the kitchen for its taking care of us. When I blurted out the truth to him, however, the poor man actually had to vomit. For many days afterwards, until he was certain that the last bit of horse meat had been consumed, he only ate meatless meals. Trouble began to brew again a few days later. We were pulling security on a slight rise from which we could get a good glimpse of the village of Sergeyevo. The village itself was in our hands, but behind it were the Russians. We were supposed to help beat back an expected attack. Toward evening, Ivan actually did move from out of the woods with 4 tanks and infantry. It was easy to repulse the attack from our elevated position. The tank commanders even stood outside their tanks during the engagement and directed fire. 4 T-34S went up in flames. At that point, the Russians pulled back into the woods. The fighting didn't stop until the end of the year. On November 25th, we had to support 1 battalion from the 503rd Infantry Regiment in its attack against some woods to the west of Sergeyevo. According to the plan, it started at dawn. Our 4 tanks had occupied their positions, and we saw, somewhat surprised, that our infantry comrades were rushing upright toward the woodline. We admired their élan, but were even more surprised that the Russians allowed it to occur without any interference. After we had advanced about 70 meters, we found the solution to the mystery. The men who were hurrying to the woods were not our comrades after all, but Russians who had dug in during the night. They were clearing out prior to our attack. Our foot soldiers were on line with us to the right and left and were waiting for our involvement. Ivan had the incredible good fortune that we had deceived ourselves in the morning twilight. We then had to slug it out with them in the woods, when we could have finished them off without any problems in the open field. The battalion commander, Hauptmann Johann Meyer, was severely wounded in the evening by a Soviet sniper in the trees. We all feared he wouldn't reach the main aid station alive because he was shot in the lungs. Because of that, I was even happier when I received greetings from him in the hospital in 1944. Just prior to his severe wounding, he had become the 329th soldier to be awarded the Oak Leaves to the Knight's Cross. Because of his wounding, he almost didn't get to participate in his own award ceremony. On December 2nd, I was employed with Oberfeldwebel Zweti at Gorushka in order to cut off some more of the pipeline via an advance with the infantry. The Russians had dug themselves in extremely well on a small but commanding rise. They had always been masters at that. Beyond the hill and to each side of it, they had set up heavy weapons such as AT guns, mortars, and the like. We could not engage them. We had to drive along a trail, which led to a completely impassable bridge. The Russians had a tremendous line of sight and greeted us with mortar attacks. I could have killed the commander of the engineers, a Hauptmann. While the bridge was certainly not negotiable, he had assured us that we could easily get through the ditch on the right-hand side. Understandably, he didn't want to reinforce the bridge right in the line of sight of the enemy. But I had just as little desire to remain stuck in the ditch and perform an unnecessary recovery in front of the Russians. The Hauptmann soon appeared and demanded that I immediately initiate the attack. One word led to another, and Ivan accompanied our harsh words with a little friendly fire. When he finally started talking about malingering, cowardice, and so on, I abruptly ripped my iron cross from my jacket and tossed it at his feet. I mounted up and drove off. I immediately got bogged down so firmly and deeply that I could easily reach the ground with a single step from the turret. The Hauptmann had been taught a lesson. He had also vanished into thin air, as they say. Not that I could blame him, since Ivan, who had observed our senseless undertaking at close range, could have practically fired down our turret hatches. I waved to Zweti, and we hooked up the cable. It was really more luck than anything else that nothing else happened. Only a piece of shrapnel from a mortar round disfigured my temple. Like a fool, I let my gunner pull it out after we had got our vehicle free again. It required backing up and a lot of effort. The wound began to bleed like crazy. Apparently, a larger vein had been ripped open, and Zweti had to apply an expert pressure dressing. Our first aid instruction proved itself well. I now had a fine white turban on me. It helped serve as wonderful camouflage in the snow-covered landscape. We had already painted the tanks white, as was usual in winter. My head scarcely stuck out at greater distances, a blessing in disguise. That evening, the engineer captain sent me my award along with a letter. He apologized and assured me that the bridge would be negotiable by the following morning. We did, in fact, cross the bone of defensive battle at Newell 39, contention in the early morning light, without major problems. It swayed a little, to be sure, but it still held. Using luck and skill, we crossed a minefield. I had Zweti drive in my tracks behind me. We were then right in front of the Russians. We could see into their foxholes on the forward slope. We then gave our infantry a little breathing room. Zweti quickly finished off the 2 AT guns that had covered the mines. The guys to our right then began firing point-blank at us with AT rifles. None of the vision blocks were functioning anymore after a short period of time. Zweti tried in vain to find one of the riflemen, but those guys always went to other positions and then disappeared again as fast as lightning. We reconned by fire along the entire length of the earthen fortifications. The Russians were so sure of themselves, however, that they even threw hand grenades out from under their cover. When we advanced a little, the first AT round was already hissing past my head. It seemed senseless to move ahead any more until after the infantry had advanced to us. We thus stood there for a few hours without seeing anything of our comrades. They didn't exit their foxholes at all, because Ivan controlled the entire area from the trees. Even we had to button up since we feared that the Russians could shoot us from above. In the afternoon, Zweti pointed out to me that a puddle was under the rear of my tank. I didn't have a good feeling. The driver started up the motor, and the thermometer immediately climbed to more than 250 degrees. The Russians had shot a hole in the radiator with their AT rifles and mortars. What could be done? Jumping ship or towing was impossible in our situation. We therefore had to try to get back over the bridge under our own power and without the pistons freezing up. Misery loves company. Zweti had forgotten to switch back to receive. That meant that I got splendid reception of the conversation in his tank, something which was of little interest to me at that time. Those are the things that make one realize just how necessary the hated battle drills are. It was beat into a radio operator's head a dozen times a day to switch back to receive immediately after transmitting a radio call. And then, in this situation, it still didn't work. I began to wave from the hatch with my headphones in order to point out to Zwetti that I wanted to talk to him. There wasn't any time to lose because of the steadily leaking radiator. He finally noticed my waving and rudely awakened his radio operator, something which I could also hear. I directed the driver of my wingman through the mines. He had to drive blind backwards, but he guided us through. With a great deal of anxiety, we reached the bridge. It had already suffered due to our first crossing. It was sagging in the middle. We crossed our fingers and were able to do it. After about 100 meters, we were protected from the Russians' sight by low, marshy woods. We never again attempted an attack at that location. It was simply impossible for the infantry. No one could reach that hill alive, even though it was so palpably close in front of us. On December 12th, we were sent to Loez on the Vitebsk-Newell Rollbahn. The Russians were exerting pressure from the east on a broad front against our lines there. During the first couple of days, we only had one mission. We had to drive a few kilometers up and down along the Rollbahn to feign larger panzer formations to the Russians. On December 16th, using armour support, the enemy attempted to attack over the hill where we had knocked out a Russian anti-tank gun a few weeks before. We immediately launched a successful counterattack. Many enemy tanks were knocked out by us in the process. Ivan could have avoided these losses if he had moved over the hill en masse with his tanks. They felt their way forward, however, somewhat anxiously and one after another. We had an easy time with them. On the other hand, we had a lot of trouble with the Russian fighters. They lurched past us, almost without a break. That's really the way one has to describe that type of flying. My gunner, Unteroffizier Kramer, can take credit for a deed that was probably unparalleled on the Eastern Front. He succeeded in shooting down a Russian fighter with the tank cannon. Of course, he was also helped by chance. This was how it happened. Kramer, upset by the unrelenting nuisance of these guys, elevated his cannon along the approach route. I talked him in. He took a chance and pulled the trigger. On the second attempt, he hit one of the bees in its wing. The Russian crashed behind us. On the same day, we received yet another breather. 2 Russians collided and tore each other apart before crashing. In the evening, I had a situation briefing with the regimental commander of the infantry. It took longer than expected. I was finally able to start back around 2 o'clock in the morning. On the way, I found our infantry in front of the Rollbahn. They were just settling down. Occasionally, the Russians fired over the road with a carbine or a machine gun. Just before the point where I knew my tanks were, I quietly walked along the road leading south, that is, toward home. The tank crews had shrunk down to 2 men per vehicle. They were looking for me. My long absence had upset them. We were very happy to see one another again. Zwetti told me that our front lines had been lost on the stretch of Rollbahn I had walked down. The road was in no man's land. In the meantime, the enemy was continuously bringing up reinforcements. Only with difficulty could our position be held much longer. Russian troops and materiel were arriving from the east in trucks that had their headlights on. They were unconcerned about our countermeasures. Our artillery fire came sparingly, and not until after the enemy columns had already disappeared. The next day, we once again attacked along the Rollbahn leading north. We wanted to make it possible for our infantry to win back the position vacated the previous day. The Russians were already just to the right of the road. A Stalin organ located in the open registered on us. My tank was hit in the front by a rocket. Using the radio, Zwetti asked what had happened. At first, he couldn't recognize anything in the smoke. We had been lucky. We then cleared out quickly from the enemy's line of sight. Despite repeated attempts, our infantry wasn't able to advance to the east over the Rollbahn. The Russians, on the other hand, began crossing over from the other side. During the process, we were able to admire the composure of a Soviet commissar who stood upright in the midst of the fire and stubbornly waved his men on. The machine guns appeared unable to touch him. We flew into a rage, and Kramer blew him into the air with the 88. The Russians then ran back across the Rollbahn again. Despite that, our attack was called off. A new front line was set up farther west. When I got back to the regimental command post, the commander was in an uproar. 2 Alsatians had disappeared. Actually, at that point in the war, they weren't supposed to be used at the front anymore. Because of their dependability, someone had made an exception, and it was feared they had crossed the lines and spilled the beans. There was another painful incident with 2 captured Russian T-34S. The 2 German tanks were pulling security and came back in the evening twilight. Our pack elements, which had no idea there were German crews inside, promptly knocked both of them out. The painted-on Balkan cross could no longer be recognized in the dusk. From then on, it was impossible to get any of our men to mount a captured tank. Our days in the Newell sector were numbered. New and difficult missions were waiting for us south of Leningrad. The front at Newell still hadn't settled down when we quickly withdrew to go to the next railhead. We were needed even more for the withdrawal movements in the Leningrad area. Our objective was the choke point of Gatschina on the Leningrad-Narwa road. During our departure from the Newell front, bridges and rail lines were already going up in the air behind us. The front had to be pulled back a good distance again. At this juncture, I have to sing the praises of a special group, the recovery platoon of our maintenance company. These men performed the impossible. The platoon leader, Lieutenant Ruidel, would have much preferred to have stayed with his friends in the tank company, but he was irreplaceable. Such a post could only be filled by an extraordinary person. Not one of us envied him at all. One has to try to imagine what the recovery platoon's mission was. The men, usually under enemy fire, had to tow immobilized tanks with their 18-ton prime movers. On many occasions, the heavy recovery vehicles had to drive up to and in front of the forward-most positions at night. There they freed the tanks with winches, attached their cables, and then hauled them out. With normal ground conditions, that would work to a certain extent, as long as the infantry remained quiet and didn't alert the enemy by firing flares. But our men also had to do their work in snow and ice. Moving a 60-ton Tiger safely with 2 prime movers in tandem at the front demanded a lot of experience and uncommon nerves. Whenever the enemy sat dead on our heels, as was the case in all fighting withdrawals, a mistake usually meant the loss of a valuable vehicle. Luckily, we reached the train station before its demolition. We loaded up and steamed off in the direction of Gatschina. The great haste didn't bode well. All sorts of things were probably going on up there, and once again we had the mission to be the fire brigade. Our misgivings proved correct. The main train station in Gatschina was already under artillery fire when we arrived, so we couldn't unload there any more. In addition, we received the news that our first company had already been committed and had taken a beating. It had been sent to battle straight from the offload ramp. The reason was that the Russians had broken through to the west with superior forces between Leningrad and Gatschina. They directed one of their main thrusts along the shoreline road. The other one was in the vicinity of Pushkin, east of Gatschina. The unfortunate incident that I already indicated previously in the text caught up with us. We had reconnoitred all the bridges between Gatschina and Leningrad, so they could be made negotiable for heavy tanks. That had been done in the meantime, but our comrades came too late to blow up the bridges. We had therefore done practically all the work for Ivan. Because of this, he could roll forward at a brisk pace. When we arrived, we discovered the sad details of the destruction of our first company. It had been surrounded on the Rollbahn by Russian tanks. Lieutenant Meyer's platoon was almost completely annihilated. Meyer himself put his pistol to his head when the Russians tried to take him prisoner. We were crestfallen by this news. In my mind, I faulted the commander for not delaying the employment of the men until all companies were together. Later, I realized that there had been no other way. To a certain extent, every unit drives off into the unknown. No one had an exact orientation on the battlefield situation. Moreover, Major Yide was the best commander we ever had in the 502nd. He was always an example to us, because he stood up for his men without exception. He always surfaced during critical situations. That was how we knew him, and why we will never forget him. It zipped around like a cat on fire. It's unbelievable how long such a flare round burns when one is waiting for it to go out. We were quite lucky that nothing happened to any of us during this accident. For hours we pulled security outside of the village without anything stirring. Suddenly, around 2 in the morning, I heard mortar fire. The impacting rounds were actually too short, but there was no doubt at all. They were meant for us. Soon the village was under extremely heavy fire. The Russians had noticed that it was occupied and wanted to clean up the affair before they advanced farther to the west. Their methods showed, however, that they certainly didn't suspect an entire tiger company in the village. I saw muzzle fire in the wood line, moving farther to the right from flash to flash. Those had to be tanks moving along the wood line, wanting to reach the road at the opposite end of the village. Oberfeldwebel Sveti was in position there. Behind him was von Schiller's tank. I radioed to Sveti. With the help of a flare, I could determine that a T-34 was moving no more than 50 meters away from Sveti. Due to the firing, we couldn't hear any motor noises, which meant the enemy had already made their way into the village. Sveti shot his neighbour into flames, but we were astonished to see a second T-34 in the middle of the village street, right next to von Schiller. It often proved fateful to the Russians that they kept completely buttoned up. Because of that, they could scarcely see anything, especially at night. They also had infantrymen riding on the tank, but even they didn't recognize the situation until too late. Von Schiller wanted to turn his turret, but hit the Russian tank with his cannon in the process. He had to back up first in order to be able to knock it out. I didn't feel confident enough to shoot. It was one of the craziest situations I ever experienced. After Sveti finished off another 3 tanks, the Russians pulled back. Apparently their losses were enough. We stayed in radio contact for the rest of the night and could hear the Russians quite well on one channel, meaning they couldn't be too far from us. At dawn, our infantrymen approached the T-34 somewhat carelessly. It still stood directly next to von Schiller. Except for a hole in the hull, it was undamaged. Surprisingly, as they went to open the turret hatch completely, it was closed. Immediately afterward, a hand grenade flew out of the tank and severely wounded 3 soldiers. Von Schiller took the enemy under fire again, but it wasn't until the 3rd shot that the Russian tank commander left his tank, collapsing severely wounded. The other Russians were dead. We took the Soviet lieutenant to division, but he couldn't be interrogated anymore. He succumbed to his injuries along the way. This incident proved to us how careful we had to be. This Russian had passed on detailed reports to his unit about us. He would only have had to turn his turret slowly to knock out von Schiller at point-blank range. I remember how we cursed the stubbornness of this Soviet lieutenant at the time. Nowadays, I have another opinion. The withdrawal movements of Army Group North were disrupted considerably by the outflanking maneuvers of the Russians. The withdrawal route became more and more congested by the units pressing together, especially since our enemy increasingly blocked our route. We had our hands full trying to keep the route somewhat open. In the process, we frequently had the opportunity to admire the exemplary combat discipline of our opponents. On one occasion, we were able to beat back an attack that was literally executed as if in a training area. The Russians had attacked a few kilometers west of us with a fully equipped infantry regiment supported by tanks, moving from north to south toward our retreat route. We approached them from the east along their left flank and experienced a spectacle seldom seen in war. Ivan had left his flanks unprotected, as he often did, and maneuvered in front of our eyes as if on a drill field. We stopped at the edge of a village and opened fire. For the time being, the enemy tanks fell victim to our fire. These losses didn't appear to disturb the Russian infantry at all, and they continued to advance unconcerned. It never once happened that 2 Russians rushed at the same time next to one another. After 3 or 4 steps, they always disappeared into the earth, thus reaching the rollbarn without armour support. We then had to clear it again. The spectacle proved once again how valuable proper battle drill is and how low the casualties are when everyone knows how to manoeuvre properly. Whenever we finished clearing the retreat route to the front, it immediately began to get hot again at the rear. This wild state of affairs continued uninterrupted up to the Narwa. One night, the Russians even succeeded in encircling a division command post. It wasn't difficult for us to smash them out again, since the Russians could only execute their flanking maneuvers with fast units, like motorized infantry, light anti-tank guns, and light tanks. In the morning, the staff could continue its move. The general rode on my tank as the last one out. We landed in a sticky situation just in front of the junction at Wolosawo. Our mission was to hold a position outside the village of Opolya at all costs until the order to move out came. We were on the southern edge of the roll barn, with the village about 100 metres on the other side of the road. In the morning, everything was still clear of the enemy, and the rearward flood of troops rolled past us. An infantry battalion was covering behind our 4 Tigers. Because many units weren't motorised, the withdrawal proceeded in fits and starts. Except for a few stragglers, the roll barn was as good as empty in the afternoon. Then the village in front of us came to life. We saw figures running back and forth, and we had to be on our toes. Once again, it promised to be a very pleasant night. As darkness fell, the infantry battalion departed. I was left alone with my 4 Tigers for miles around. Fortunately, the Russians weren't aware of our sticky situation. Perhaps they had too much respect for us. They set up AT guns in positions across from us twice, but we never let them fire more than a single round. They didn't make a third attempt. The Russian commander appeared to believe that we would also leave in the morning. In any case, he assumed there were various infantry with us. Otherwise, he would have probably approached our tanks on foot. Shortly before midnight, vehicles appeared from the west. We were able to recognize them in time as ours. It was a Fusilier battalion which had missed its link-up and advanced to the roll barn late. As I later discovered, the commander was in the only tank leading the way and was completely drunk. The disaster occurred with great alacrity. The entire unit had no idea of what was going on and moved openly into the Russian fields of fire. A terrible panic followed when machine gun and mortar fire kicked off. Many soldiers were hit. With no one in charge, everyone ran back on the roll barn instead of seeking cover in the area south of it. Any form of comradeship had disappeared. The only thing that counted was every man for himself. The vehicles drove right over the wounded, and the roll barn offered a portrait of horror. This disaster could have been prevented had the commander of this mob done his duty and led his men cross-country instead of sitting in his tank and sleeping off his drunk. After the Russians' fire let up, the radio operators and tank commanders of our Tigers crawled to the roll barn to save at least a few of the severely wounded. We took care of them as best we could and placed them on the tanks. This effort to save the men was made more difficult by the moonlight. Ivan could observe all of our movements from the houses, while we could only identify the enemy by their muzzle fire. Our position became increasingly precarious. I spoke with the battalion at least every 15 minutes, but the requested order did not come. The Russians launched very unpleasant mortar barrages at regular intervals without approaching any closer to us, but even so the damage was serious enough. Toward morning, Feldwebel Vesely reported that his tank's radiator had a hole shot in it. The same report came a half-hour later from a second tank. That meant we had to tow both vehicles with the remaining 2 tanks. We couldn't afford a complete loss because we knew how hard it was to get new tanks. The drivers also had a hard time leaving their tanks, much like riders in earlier times had in taking leave of their horses. I reported the new situation to the battalion. After about 20 minutes, the long-awaited order to evacuate arrived. We hooked up the 2 disabled tanks as best we could and towed them 2 kilometres to an army food depot that was already burning brightly. Naturally, our soldiers who hadn't been able to take everything with them weren't going to bestow it to Ivan either. We turned off the roll barn to the south because, according to the latest reports, the Russians had already reached the roll barn farther to the west, making it impossible to get through. We were still in the light cast by the glowing flames of the food supply depot. We dismounted once again and hooked up the cables properly. Suddenly, an unnerving explosion shook the air. Because of the air pressure, we were thrown to the ground as if we had been mown down. At the same time, the food we had often waited for came whirling through the air toward us. Among everything else, there were boards and beams of all sizes, enough so that we could count ourselves lucky we weren't wounded in a somewhat inglorious manner. The combat engineers who blew up the depot had done a great job. It was just that the place could have gone up a little later. The rare opportunity to die a hero's death due to a can of preserves didn't excite us. So we hurried to get out of there quickly. Thanks to the frost, our route south of the road was completely negotiable. In the grey of morning, I spotted a Keeble heading for us. We were all happy when we recognized our commander. He didn't hesitate for a minute to drive out to meet us, even though no more German soldiers were to be seen far and wide, and Ivan could appear at any moment. Major Gide literally hugged me and confessed that he had already written us off. He was really happy that we had even brought back both disabled vehicles. Unfortunately, we had a sad incident with the infantrymen we had taken along with us on the last leg of the move. The men had taken a place on the rear deck. They were dead tired and scarcely capable of walking anymore. They sat above the cooling vents, where the warm air was expelled from the engine compartment. They soon fell asleep and suffered carbon monoxide poisoning because the cooling air was mixed with exhaust fumes. Despite immediate resuscitation efforts, 3 of them couldn't be saved. At that time we hadn't known any better, but from then on we were able to warn every soldier. The junction at Wolosowo was supposed to be held with all effort to ensure the return transportation of all army elements to Narwa. Oberst Wengler had set up a blocking position on the eastern edge of Wolosowo with his infantry. The rest of our battalion was incorporated into this line along with all of the pack units. The desire to get through to Wolosowo without incident was not realized. Major Gide explained that we would have to detour around a large marsh. Because of that, we would have to swing north to the Rollbahn once again. He was also nice enough not to hide the fact from us that Ivan had already reached the Rollbahn just before Wolosowo. We just had to box our way through to the west somehow. This seemed to be a practically hopeless operation during the day, so we waited for the evening. Before starting, Major Gide took a hefty swig and positioned himself at the feet of the loader in my tank. What else could he do besides cross his fingers? To use the firepower of the 2 towed vehicles, we turned their turrets backward. These crews could then cover the rear. We were scarcely on the road and turning west when a Russian AT gun started knocking on the turret from the rear. The vehicle in tow, however, soon created some breathing room for us. Despite that, we had to dismount, as the Russians had shot through a tow cable. But even that went well. We only had another 3 kilometers until the new line. Of course, the Russians on both sides of the Rollbahn wanted to finish us off. A few of them jumped onto our tanks, but without success. Our hand grenades did the trick. Whether the cursing of my steadfast driver, Kostler, scared away, Ivan could not be determined with any certainty. Shortly before our objective, we received pack fire. Our comrades thought we were the enemy. Not until we shot back with the same caliber did we get any relief. The layman will probably object that we could have identified ourselves with flares. Of course we did that. But who is concerned about flares during such a retreat when he doesn't know whether they are being used by Ivan or by his own people? In Wolosowo, we met the remainder of the company. Strong forces were ready for the defence. Oberst Wengler's soldiers were already building a defensive line around the place. It left only the road to the west open to Narwa. I was attached to Oberst Wengler with 4 combat-ready Tigers. The rest of the battalion had already departed to the railhead, where all heavy weapons were being loaded onto trains to avoid further losses. Later, we would be very happy to have the firepower of the super-heavy artillery batteries saved in this manner. Oberst Wengler was responsible for the defence of Wolosowo. Later, in honour of his infantrymen, it was always called Wenglerowo. Wengler was the model of a troop leader. He was a reservist and a bank director by profession. He had a personality that inspired complete confidence in his people. They would have gone through hell for their commander. His admirable composure was a priceless characteristic in critical situations. On one occasion, we had a situation briefing in a little wooden house about 100 meters behind the front line. The Russians were shooting from 3 sides, and it was anything but cozy. Wengler was briefing the situation to us when an impacting mortar round shattered the window. One officer was grazed on the arm and sought cover under the table. Our Oberst just looked nonchalantly in his direction and said, "Gentlemen, let's not allow ourselves to be driven crazy by this shooting. Let's stay with the subject matter at hand so we can finish and return quickly to our posts. We regained our self-confidence in no time. Only a leader who has himself under control can demand everything from his people. In Włocławek, we met members of the 11th SS Panzer Corps for the first time. Their greatest claim to fame later on was their holding of the Narwa position. We were excited to meet them, having always envied them somewhat because of their better equipment. We were pleasantly surprised. Their devil-may-care attitude consistently inspired us, even if their unsparing treatment of men and material alienated us somewhat. Wherever SS units were used, things were taken care of, but the casualties were often so great that the troops had to be pulled out for reorganization. We couldn't afford that. We had to husband our men and material. My goal was always to achieve the greatest possible success with the least possible casualties. The Russians then began exerting pressure with all their strength against Węglerowo. We were all happy when the order to withdraw finally came. With its fast motorized forces, the SS covered the withdrawal. Our special rail cars had already been spotted at the railhead. We took off with full steam ahead to the west, toward Narwa. While loading, we received some sad news. The commander of the 1st Company, Oberleutnant Diels, had been killed. A Russian tank had taken the Rollbahn under fire, and a piece of shrapnel had penetrated Diels's heart while he was sitting in his Kiebel. Old Fritz. We were happy after we had finally reached Narwa. The new position was supposed to be well fortified and strong enough to hold up the Russians. But first, we needed a long time to find our support trains. There were no quarters because all the areas around Narwa were overfilled with retreating troops. We, therefore, looked for a place to stay with other units to warm up a little. In the meantime, I set out to find the men of the 2 disabled tanks. They had apparently also already arrived in Narwa. Prepared for any eventuality, I carried 2 canisters of good pea soup with me. I imagined them standing around somewhere, freezing and hungry. Because all of the traffic was flowing against us, getting through to the east was very difficult. We found both of our tanks without any problems at the train station, but none of the people. We literally had to go searching from house to house. And then I didn't believe my eyes. My hungry and freezing men sat at a table set up as if in peacetime. They were eating cutlets and other tasty morsels, being served to no end by the lady of the house. My arrival with the cold peas was greeted with a hello, and of course I did not hesitate to partake of the better meal. It was understandable that one desired a long period of rest and a decent bed. The most heartfelt wish was sleep, sleep, sleep. As usual, things happened quite differently. We headed west to our unit on the Rollbahn. It had already become dark, and we had about 20 kilometers behind us when it was suddenly announced, "Everyone pull over to the right, oncoming traffic." We stopped and recognized a Tiger, which was passing the oncoming traffic only with great difficulty. When I stopped it, Oberfeldwebel Sveti climbed out and gave me the good news. I didn't need to drive back to the trains. He had brought the remainder of the company, and I could mount up immediately. We then proceeded east with our 4 Tigers. Bed and sleep were but a pleasant short dream. Sveti didn't know any details about our mission, just that we were supposed to report to the commander of the SS division that had to hold the bridgehead at Narwa. We tortured ourselves with thoughts all the way to Narwa and drove over the bridge built by our engineers. Excitement was in the air everywhere. In the city, we only saw SS vehicles driving back and forth. It was not easy to find the division command post because the men of the SS Panzer Grenadier Division Nordland had mostly come from Nordic countries and barely understood German, but they were practically all strapping, energetic young soldiers. Their commander was SS Brigadeführer Fritz von Scholz, whom I immediately dubbed Old Fritz. I finally found him in a unique type of command post, a bus. It was parked next to a house. It was the only divisional command post I saw during the war that was closer to the front than the regimental command posts. I reported to the operations officer, who was located in a second bus. Rank, grade, troop unit, the usual. Wishes to see the Herr General. The Hauptsturmführer then observed me with the interest one would devote to a creature from another planet. "The Herr General," he finally said, stretching each syllable. "The Herr General. We don't have that here. You are with the Waffen-SS, in case you already don't know that, and we don't have either a Herr or a General. There is probably a Brigadeführer here, without the Herr, if you would like to see him. In addition, the title of Herr also disappears from all other rank titles, up to and including the Reichsführer." I wasn't prepared for this type of reception, but immediately switched gears. "I would like to report to your Brigadeführer." The operations officer nodded. "That already sounds better," he said in a somewhat condescending tone. "Wenger, go and ask the Brigadeführer whether he has time for Herr Lieutenant Carius from the Tigers." He felt compelled to stress the word Herr in front of my rank quite distinctly. In the meantime, an Untersturmführer had stood up from his workplace and disappeared with a "Right away, Hauptsturmführer." Shortly later he appeared again. "The Brigadeführer is expecting you." I then went into the other bus and was completely surprised after everything that had preceded this, when I met a man who was the personification of sweetness and light. In my entire time at the front, I rarely encountered another divisional commander I could compare with our old Fritz. He identified completely with his troops, and his people deified him. He was always there and available to anyone. During our work together, he treated me as a son. It therefore hit all of us hard when we later discovered at Dunneberg that our old Fritz had been killed in the Nawa sector. The swords to the Knight's Cross had been awarded to him in August 1944, but what did that mean to those of us who had truly lost a frontline father? When I reported to old Fritz on the bus, he immediately patted me on the shoulder in a friendly manner. "Well then, why don't we drink a schnapps to our future work together?" he said. He poured 2 cups full and clinked glasses with me. "Where do you come from?" After my answer, our conversation continued into personal and family-type matters, during which I also described my initial impression of his troops. When I got to the part about my reception by the operations officer, he laughed. "Yeah, that's the way it is here," he then said. "At first, I also had to reorient myself somewhat when I transferred from the army. In the process, I had very mixed feelings, but now I wouldn't get rid of these guys under any circumstances. These men in the Waffen-SS are really fantastic and have a comradeship such as you'll probably never see anywhere else. But be that as it may, and also for your own personal orientation, I like to hear it when someone addresses me as Herr General. Whenever you come from the old school, such as I do, then such things somehow seem more natural to you." We then spoke about the situation. In the process, it was shown that my skepticism about the legendary Panther line had only been all too well justified. Old Fritz explained to me, "You see, if you want to be exact about it, this entire line exists only on paper. At this time of year, of course, it is completely impossible for our comrades in the front line to dig in. There are still probably a few bunkers around from the time of our advance, but they are usually not located exactly where you could use them. Besides, the Russians have advanced more quickly than anticipated. In addition to all of that, our troops have already gotten so used to continuous withdrawal that they have already passed the lines to be held. When we then wanted to occupy the front line of the bridgehead indicated on the map, we discovered that Ivan was already sitting in it. I then set up a new bridgehead line. It will be your mission to help the men up front in reaching the best positions for their sectors. They then have to be fortified and held. Since the Russians only have weak advance guard forces in the area, it shouldn't be all too difficult to push them back, thus enabling my men to fortify their front line. My mission was thus clearly outlined. In its execution, the SS men and I were supported by the artillery that we had brought back from Leningrad. Without this support, the Narwa front could never have held out for months. Our tanks were near the division command post east of the Narwa. From the south, the front ran up to the edge of the city on the eastern side of the Narwa. There, after a short distance, it jumped over to the west bank of the river, where it formed the front line until it emptied into the Baltic. The relatively quiet times were soon gone. The Russians employed increasingly stronger forces against our bridgehead. Soon they had brought up heavy and super-heavy artillery and put on a wild display of fireworks over the city. Thanks to the brave defence of the SS men, they were not successful in making inroads into the bridgehead. Only the bridge caused me worries. The Russians had it under constant artillery fire. After the railway bridge had been eliminated, it was the last crossing over the Narwa. In case of its destruction, we would have sat in a trap with our tanks and would not have been able to be used in other threatened sectors of the front. I described the situation to Old Fritz. He agreed with me to place my tanks on the west bank of the Narwa, on the other side of the bridge. In an emergency, we could always be in position in a few minutes. I then drove back over the bridge. I was looking around for a suitable assembly area for my vehicles when a Keeble with a corps flag roared up from the front. It immediately stopped, and I didn't believe my eyes when Feldmarschall Model jumped out. The High Command had ordered him, as it always did in hopeless situations, to the northern front to restore order. I made the required report, and then a storm broke over me, the likes of which one will rarely see. Model's eyebrows were twitching. I had seen this before on the Central Front. I wasn't allowed an explanation or any answer at all. I mounted up with my people and was on the other side of the Narwa in a flash. The Feldmarschall had given me an order that I will never forget. I am holding you personally responsible that no Russian tank breaks through. None of your Tigers may be lost due to enemy fire. We need every barrel here. With regard to himself, Feldmarschall Model allowed no compromise and was ruthless, but he was indulgent to the men in the front lines who adored him. He demanded nothing for himself. In the Ruhr pocket in 1945, I once heard a characteristic answer from him. The day has 24 hours. Add the night to that, and you'll probably get through with your work. Unfortunately, our guest performance with the SS Division Nordland was soon over. We continued to cover the sector for a few days until the SS men had taken root in their new positions. In the process, we were able to liberate them from 4 Russian anti-tank guns. I'll never forget the magnificent men of the Nordland Division. They fought like lions. They were better acquainted with Bolshevism through personal experience than many people of the Western world with their thick books. I discovered later that many members of the Kurland army had gotten to Sweden under the most trying of circumstances, believing that this would save them. Among them were also men of the 3rd SS Panzer Corps. They were then interned, but later handed over to the Russians under Allied pressure. When one considers that even back then the relationship between the Western powers and the Soviets wasn't the best, and that people in the West knew very well what kind of fate awaited the people who came from the Baltic states, then the decision of the Swedish government becomes even more ignominious. This was a country in which the people liked to talk so much and so gladly about the Red Cross. The Estonians, Lithuanians and Latvians of the SS went to a certain death, or at least to Siberia, just like their parents and grandparents before them. Shocking reports are available of the scenes that took place in the Swedish internment camps when the transfer to the Russians became known. Suicide and self-mutilation are a terrible indictment against a so-called host country. Men who had only taken up arms against Bolshevism to preserve their homeland, Western civilization, and, as part of that, Sweden, were delivered to certain death. Our new assignments awaited us between Narwa and the mouth of the river. The Russians were shifting the main points of their attacks there after they had suffered a setback at the Narwa bridgehead. They were trying to penetrate across the frozen Narwa and form a bridgehead on the western bank of the river. The focal point of the attacks was the village of Rigi, located on the western bank of the river, halfway between Narwa and the Baltic. Wengler's long-suffering infantrymen were there. They benefited from an old trench left over from the advance in 1941. On February 16th, I was sent to Oberst Wengler with 2 tanks to support his people in their defence against the massed attacks of the Russians over the Narwa. Wengler's command post was located about 2 kilometres behind the front lines, separated from them by marshy woods. The colonel greeted me with outstretched arms. "Well, here you are again. I'm really happy that it was you that they sent to me, since we're already on the same wavelength. The situation is pretty serious here, but you already know that. Unfortunately, I suffered quite a few casualties during the fighting during the retreat. The combat strength of my regiment on a good day consists of that of a battalion at the most. For the sector I have to hold, I really need at least an entire regiment, if not more. For that reason, the front is only thinly held. I've attempted to help myself by constructing it as a series of strong points. It's best that we take a personal look at the situation for ourselves as soon as possible. You'll gain a better impression than if I show you the whole mess on the map. We immediately took off for an orientation. Such an orientation helped us find our way around at night as well. The level of combat activity was quite high. When we arrived at the battalion command post, Wengler was told about another Russian penetration. The Russians had suffered terrific losses during their attacks, as there was no cover at all while crossing over the ice of the Narwa. But even if only a small group was successful in establishing itself on our side of the Narwa, they stuck to our trench system like leeches and had to be wiped out in immediate counter-attacks before the next attack rolled. It was clear to see that the Russians wanted to reach their objective there at all costs and without regard to casualties. We had to support the infantrymen in rolling up the occupied portions of the trenches. That required a great deal of precision while shooting, so our own people didn't fall victim to our fire. We had to approach to within about 50 metres of the trenches, which ran in the normal zigzag pattern. From there we observed the advance of our own people. Whenever they took a section, the first man waved. We then shot up the next 10 to 20 metre section with our 85mm cannons until it was ready for assault. As soon as our soldiers' helmets appeared over the edge of the trench, we stopped our fire and our men took the trench. Our teamwork functioned magnificently. The Russians were not able to chalk up a success despite their heavy casualties, but they also reacted immediately to the appearance of our tanks with artillery. They sent over quite a few very pleasant greetings to us. The eastern bank of the Narwa climbed quite steeply, and the edge of a large forested area extended along the high ground. From the woodline, Ivan was able to see quite well into our positions. We thus stuck out like a sore thumb for their artillery, which gave us many problems. As soon as we left our little bit of woods, it didn't take more than 3 minutes before we saw the first muzzle flashes on the far bank. Only by driving evasively all the time were we able to avoid a direct hit. I concentrated exclusively on the far bank, while Zweti supported the infantry with his vehicle. Although I silenced a few Russian pieces during every encounter, we were once again under fire whenever we reappeared. During one such occasion, I finally taught Lustig, one of the drivers, to dampen his innate daredevil attitude. Normally, this bundle of energy only drove me when my vehicle was disabled, but his tank commander had often told me that he was a wild man who always charged to the front and could hardly be convinced to back up. Certainly a praiseworthy, if also dangerous, characteristic. Lustig was a blacksmith by trade, a guy built like a fireplug. Once, when a lit cigar stump had fallen between his shirt and his skin, instead of opening up the layers of clothing that we wore in winter to take it out, he simply extinguished it on his bare skin from the outside. When he shook hands with me, I felt like a horse had kicked me. That was our man Lustig, a man whose heart was in the right place. He always drove to the front and was unstoppable in front of the enemy. But one day, as I said, he also learned to control his impetuosity. We were about 500 metres in front of our little woods when the Russians opened fire. The first salvo landed too short, the second behind us. I didn't want to wait for the third, since we could then count on a hit. I called out to Lustig, "Back up!" but he didn't react. So we stayed there, and the Russians fired off their third salvo. The impacting rounds began to land all around us, and a 28 cm Colossus landed directly in front of us on the trail. It didn't explode. Like a large mouse, it skittered along as a dud toward us, sliding under our vehicle. We later saw it in front of the woods on our move back. After this incident, even our friend Lustig was convinced there was no more time to be lost whenever I gave him the command to back up. Again and again, we admired the quality of the steel on our tanks. It was hard without being brittle. Despite its hardness, it was also elastic. If an AT round didn't hit the armour dead on, it slid off on its side and left behind a gouge, as if you had run your finger over a soft piece of butter. At night, we couldn't help our long-suffering comrades very much. We would have endangered them by shooting. We just fired up the ice-covered surface of the Narwa whenever a new Russian attack started. By doing that, we could steal some of Ivan's thunder. They often attempted to cross as many as a dozen times during the night, even employing sleds. Despite their enormous casualties, they wanted to force the river. Whenever they did it, we called it stubbornness. Of course, when we did it, it was bravery. We were forced to become thoroughly familiar with the reversed application of such terms after the war. The soldier who had performed his duty for his country to the very end was suddenly a militarist and a warmonger, in short, an evil Nazi. After it had finally become somewhat quieter in the Rigi sector, we received new marching orders. I took leave of Oberst Wengler, and as we wished one another continued good luck, he hesitantly revealed to me that he probably had the hardest and longest battle of his life in front of him. He intended to get married. The occasion that allowed his wedding was the awarding of the oak leaves to the Knight's Cross, for which he was returning to Germany. He was the 404th soldier to receive this high award. Unfortunately, his young marriage came to an all-too early end. Wengler was killed as a general major in 1945 in the West, after he had been awarded the swords to his Knight's Cross. He was the 123rd soldier of the Wehrmacht to receive it. To make the following operations understandable, I have to discuss the layout of the defensive positions along the Narwa, as it was known to the battalion staff on February 24, 1944. The river presented itself as a defensive position. If one follows it upstream, it initially runs about 10 kilometers in a southeasterly direction from its mouth in the Bay of Finland. It flows past Riigi and Sivertsi and toward the city of Narwa before turning south. After 1 or 2 kilometers, it curves to the west. This leg, where the Narwa flows for almost 10 kilometers from east to west, will be important for the following narrative. Following this section, one then reaches the northeast corner of Lake Peipus, after about 45 kilometers in a south-southeasterly direction. When we were withdrawn from Rigi, the front ran from the Bay of Narwa, from Hungerberg to be exact, along the western bank of the river. It went via Rigi to just before Narwa. It then jumped over to the eastern bank, where the bridgehead had been formed in front of the city. This bridgehead was necessary for holding the city. The front line met the Narwa again, where it made its bend. It had been intended to continue the line on the eastern bank. It had even been planned to build a bridgehead in the middle of the east-west leg that followed. As so often happened, however, the Russians put an end to our plans in that regard. The Narva-Waiwara-Wesenberg railway line ran parallel to this east-west axis of the Narwa, about 8 kilometers to the north. Another 800 meters to the north was the Rollbahn. From there it was another 5 to 6 kilometers to the Baltic coast. The area between the river and the Rollbahn was completely marshy. The railway went over a reinforced embankment. The infantry units, which were supposed to occupy the east-west axis to form the planned bridgehead to the south, arrived too late. One had assumed that the Russians had not yet advanced as far as the Narwa in that area. Because of the marshy terrain, one also considered it unlikely that the Russians would establish themselves north of the river. According to the High Command, the marshy area was completely ill-suited for establishing a position. When our guys wanted to occupy their positions, however, they made the embarrassing discovery that Ivan had already pushed forward with strong forces between the northern bank of the Narwa and the Rollbahn. He had established a bridgehead there from which he threatened our troops in Narwa. Our units were too weak to force him back to the south over the river. As a result of all these difficulties, our front line took on a highly original character. It ran north of the railway embankment and consisted of strongpoints. At about the middle of this leg, however, it pushed into the enemy bridgehead on both sides of a trail. There it had the shape of a boot. The northern portion of the Russian-occupied terrain was thus split into 2 parts, the East Sack and the West Sack. Both of these sacks became standard terms in the Wehrmacht reports. The trail, which led out of the boot to the north, went through the village of Ep.2 after crossing the railway. After about another 800 meters, it reached some high ground that jutted out of the somewhat flat terrain like a large molehill. Just behind it, the trail emptied into the main roll barn. This trail was crossed by a second one in Limbitu. It ran from the west, parallel to the railroad, and brushed past a farmhouse behind the edge of the village. From the farmhouse, it led diagonally to the railway embankment and reached a second railway crossing after about 130 meters. Along the leg from the farmhouse to the rail crossing, there were 2 additional houses located at approximately equidistant intervals. I wanted to preface my upcoming narration with this detailed description of the terrain so that the reader could form a mental picture of our operations in this area. The map provided in this chapter also gives additional information about the area where we fought it out with the Russians. When we returned from Rigi to the company trains, located about 25 kilometers west of Narwa, in an area between the coast and the roll barn, I immediately drove on to the battalion command post to report to the commander. He asked me to relieve our company commander at Limbitu that same day. He was not in the best of health. Our company was distributed among the individual infantry regiments. The company commander was at Limbitu with 2 Tigers. There were an additional 4 at the West Sack. Using a Kaibel, I immediately drove to Limbitu to relieve the commander. As I drove down the road from the Kinderheim, that was the name given to the high ground north of Limbitu, I noticed where the front line ran from the amount of combat activity. The commander was happy that I had come so quickly and immediately disappeared with my Kaibel. Feldwebel Kirsche was sitting in the second vehicle and served as its commander. We always got along well. Whenever both of us were together, I always felt better in an operation. My comrades explained the situation to me. According to them, the Russians were sitting behind the railway embankment and making themselves at home there. The embankment was so high that one could easily dig tunnels into it. These served as bunkers. Our men were in the farmhouse and in both of the houses between it and the Russian rail crossing. Our tanks were behind the farmhouse. At night, pairs of sentries had to maintain contact between the strongpoints. It had been decided against a trench system, as the regimental commander was of the opinion that the current lines were only temporary ones. His command post was located on the back slope of the Kinderheim. It fell off so sharply on the eastern side that they had dug tunnels into the mountain, thus safe from any type of fire. After the first night, I reached an agreement with the infantry commander that we should pull security during the day and his people at night. My men also needed to have a few hours of rest as long as it was possible. We laid a wire from the farmhouse to a house west of the road crossing in the village. I was thus always able to be in position whenever something was happening. On the first evening, of course, we did not drive back to our rest position. I wanted to take a look at the positions first. This was only possible during darkness. The infantrymen were quite surprised when I expressed my desire to get acquainted with the positions. Apparently they had never experienced that before. But I had my own ideas on that subject. How were we supposed to support people effectively when we really didn't know their positions inside and out? How was teamwork supposed to function if we didn't know one another better? For us tankers, positional warfare and any type of operation within the front lines was certainly nothing to shout about. We weren't born to hang around the countryside as large targets. Our missions were attack and counterattack, that is, operations on the move. But what were the poor guys there supposed to do without us? They were in a position that could not be held without tanks. I therefore went to the nearest house with the first pair of sentries. It was about 70 meters away. The route could not be seen by the Russians at night, as there were small trees and marsh vegetation between us and the railway embankment. The strong point had been occupied by a company, just like the farmhouse. One shouldn't be deceived by the word company, however. That meant 25 to 30 men. This imposing number had only been achieved because replacements from home had arrived shortly before. Raw recruits who still needed to learn about the front were sitting there, astonishingly willing and eager to see action. I went with the roving sentries from this strong point to the third one, only 30 to 40 meters from the railway embankment. There was no cover to the right, but the Russians behind the railway embankment appeared to be concerned with themselves. Only occasionally did a shot ring through the night and force us face down in the mud. Ivan probably only wanted to prove that he was still there. We were only a few meters away from the enemy in the most forward strongpoint. In general, the front was quiet. Only occasionally did a round from our artillery rustle close overhead through the air and explode on the other side of the railway embankment. Once in a while, we heard the Russians call to one another and perceived sounds that made us assume that the construction of positions was in progress. The Russians had to fortify their dugouts, just like we did, and improve their roads to bring up heavy materiel.